3, verse 1. So the book of Ecclesiastes has that and many other kind of famous or semi-famous quotes. Let's take a look at what it is. So getting back to our picture that we showed for the book of Esther, or the book of Song of Songs, the Hebrew word for the Bible is Tanakh, T-N-K-H. So you have Torah, Nevi'im with an N, and Ketuvim, writings, the third section of the Bible, the way Jews divide it. And again, we're in the Megillot section, the scroll section. So last time we looked at Song of Songs, which we do on Passover, Ruth, which we do on Shavuot. We're going to skip this, which we do in the summer, and then we're going to go to Ecclesiastes, which we read in the fall. So that's where Ecclesiastes comes in the Hebrew Bible. Each of the Megillot is read on a particular Jewish holiday. So the Song of Songs read on Passover, Ruth is read on Shavuot, Lamentations we read on Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the month of Av, and Ecclesiastes we read on Sukkot. And at the end of this talk, we'll talk about why we read Ecclesiastes on the book of on the festival of Sukkot. So what is Ecclesiastes? Ecclesiastes is a wisdom book, a book of wisdom. And as we saw from the slide before, there are 3 other books of wisdom in the Bible: Psalms, Proverbs, and Job. So this is a book of wisdom literature, and this is a picture of Rodin's famous sculpture, The Thinker, because I always figure this is what philosophers do. They look just like this all day long, and they think deep thoughts. And so that's what the book of Ecclesiastes does. And so now we're back here. And who wrote the book of Ecclesiastes? Well, as we're going to see in a minute, it claims to be written by a king, and a king who claims to be the son of David. Well, we know who that king was. That king was King Solomon. But, of course, all the subsequent kings of Judah were also descendants of David, so maybe it's metaphorical. Maybe he is a later descendant of King David. Probably not. More likely, first of all, we know the book wasn't written by Solomon. Why? Because the Hebrew language in it is too modern for that time period. It's like several hundred years too late for it to have been written back in David's time. And we talked about that before. Just like Shakespeare sounds a little strange to us today because it's written in Elizabethan English from only a few hundred years ago, same thing happens in biblical Hebrew. There's ancient forms of Hebrew and more modern forms of Hebrew, and the language used in the book of Ecclesiastes is much too late for it to have been written in King Solomon's time. Also, as we're going to see, there are definite echoes of Greek philosophy in it. And so the Greek philosophy entered the Jewish world after Alexander the Great conquers the land of Israel, about 330 before the Common Era. So the book had to have been written sometime after 330. So it could still be a late descendant of King David, but probably not. Most likely this was written by a very thoughtful, philosophical person who studied Greek philosophy because it was in the air at the time. But he didn't just accept it at face value. He added to it, thought about it, modified it, structured it to fit his way of thinking about things. As we'll see, there's some differences. And so he's a philosopher, thinker, and what he's doing is he's sort of writing what we might call historical fiction, claiming to be a descendant of King David, or King David's son. He certainly claims to be somewhat of a wealthy man, which he may well have been. Probably only wealthy people could afford to hire philosophy tutors, and it seems like he's well schooled. So he may have had some money, and he's going to say, well, we'll see what he says. In any case, it's written sometime between 330 and 190. How do we know that it's written before 190, before the Common Era? Because it's referred to by another book with a very similar sounding name. This book is Ecclesiastes. That book is Ecclesiasticus. And Ecclesiasticus is not found in our Bible. It's actually found in the Catholic Bible in the Apocrypha section, or the intertestamental writings, the writings between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So they included a bunch of books written by Jews during those early centuries before Jesus, because they thought they were important books to include in their canon, and we didn't include them in ours, so they're not in our Bible. But Ecclesiasticus, as the name would imply, seems to be playing off the earlier book, Ecclesiastes. Right? It assumes you've already read that book, and now we're going to have a second take on similar themes. And therefore, we know when that book was written in the year 190, so that has to be the latest the earlier book could have been written. So somewhere between 330 and 190, probably in the 200s sometime. That's when it was written. Now, before we get into any other crazy stuff, let's just take a look at what the book actually says. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, here we go, yeah, okay. Here are some quotations from the book of Ecclesiastes. So it opens with the words, Divrei Kohelet ben David melech Yerushalayim. Divrei, the words of Kohelet. So Kohelet, you can see, is Kuf He Lamed. And we know another word in Hebrew that we use a lot, Kihila, which means congregation, and it comes from the same root. So we don't know exactly what this author meant by Kohelet. It's a word that's used basically only here in this book, a clever use of the word. And perhaps he means, I am the one who convenes the congregation. I am a convener of a congregation, or I'm one who speaks to the congregation. So it could be someone who is just speaking to a large group of people, or somebody who gathers people together to speak to them. Anyway, he is Kohelet, the son of David, king of Jerusalem. And then he starts right off with his depressing view of the world. Havel Havalim, Amar Kohelet. Havel Havalim, Hakol Havel. I wanted you to get sort of a sense of what it sounds like in the Hebrew. It's very poetic sounding. Utter futility, says Kohelet. Utter futility, all is futile. What real value is there for a man in all the gains he makes beneath the sun? One generation goes, another one comes, but the earth remains the same forever. The sun rises, the sun sets, and it glides back to where it rises. Southward blowing, northward blowing, turning northward. Ever turning blows the wind. On its rounds the wind returns. All streams flow into the sea, but the sea is never full. To the place from which they flow, the streams flow back again. I don't know if he knew about evaporation, of course, but that is what happens. The water evaporates off the sea, off the level surface of the sea, goes back up into the air, and then comes down as rain, which starts the flow of water back down to the sea again. I don't know if he knew that or not, but he seems to be referring to that over here. But here his point is, one day comes, another day comes, day after day after day, and what does it all really mean? Well, everything is like nothing, emptiness. By the way, the term vanity here, Havel Havalim, may have originally meant vapor. And vapor is like this, just this emptiness, this sort of evaporating kind of something that turns into nothingness, right? And so that's what all of life is, just like this vapor that disappears and goes away. Pretty depressing. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear of hearing. Only that shall happen which has happened. There's nothing new that's going to happen. Only that occurred which has occurred. There is nothing new beneath the sun. This is a very famous statement. Ein chadash tachat hashemesh. There is nothing new under the sun. And it comes from Kohelet. Everything that you have seen has been done before. We've seen this picture before, right? And so all of life is just kind of emptiness. Now, he does start out pretty depressing, and we'll see some more depressing stuff, but he ends kind of in a more positive way. I don't think he intends us to leave depressed. Remember, at the end, I'll talk about why we read this book, and then why we read it on Sukkot, which is supposed to be the holiday of our great joy, right? So while we're celebrating and happy and smiling and dancing, we're reading this seemingly kind of depressing book. That's the opening chapter of Kohelet. Let's take a look at a little snippet from chapter 2. There is nothing worthwhile for a man but to eat and drink and afford himself enjoyment with his means. And even that, I noted, comes from God. For who eats and who enjoys but me, right? Another way to translate that would be, who else should eat and enjoy? If I don't, I should eat and enjoy just like everybody else. We should all just eat and drink and be merry. And if that sounds familiar, it's not because it comes from Greek philosophy, but actually it's found originally in the book of Isaiah. Instead, there was rejoicing and merriment, killing of cattle and slaughtering of sheep, right? So why do you kill and cattle and sheep because you're going to have roasted barbecue, right? So we're going to have tons of barbecue meat. We're going to rejoice, and we're going to eat meat and drink wine, eat and drink, for tomorrow we die, right? That's the famous statement, and it comes actually from Isaiah. Now, many people think it sounds familiar to the Epicurean philosophy. Here in Houston, we have the Epicurean supermarket, which has fine foods for sale, right? An Epicurean is one who delights in the finest of food, the finest of wines, the finest of clothing, etc. And this idea of Epicureanism comes from a Greek philosopher whose name was Epicurus. We also get the Yiddish expression Epicurus, which refers to somebody who's a non-believer, somebody who's left the Jewish faith, right? So you've abandoned Judaism and you've gone Greek. You've become a Greek person like Epicurus. So let's take a look at what Epicurus actually says. There is a little difference with Ecclesiastes, but there's certainly some similarities as well. So let's go back and take a look again at what Epicurus says. Here we go. Okay, so here is Epicurean. I just borrowed this from Wikipedia. Epicureanism is a system of philosophy based on the teachings of the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus, founded around 307. So again, since it seems Ecclesiastes seems to be quite aware of Epicurus, clearly was written after 307, but before 109. So Epicurus was an atomic materialist. Let's skip that because I didn't highlight it. His materialism led him to a general attack on superstition and divine intervention. He believed in the gods, Epicurus, but he didn't believe the gods had anything to do with this world. They certainly didn't intervene in supernatural ways, so forget about that. Epicurus believed that what he called pleasure is the greatest good. The best thing to do in life is to enjoy yourself. But, and here's the key, the way to attain such pleasure is to live modestly and to gain knowledge of the workings of the world and limits of one's desires. So it's interesting that nowadays we call an Epicurean somebody who delights in the finest of foods, but Epicurus himself was actually, you know what? Try to be satisfied with the minimum amount, right? Try to be satisfied with just, whatever little pleasures you can get in life. Don't try to be to acquire too much, because it's pointless basically in life. So he wanted to get pleasure from living modestly, not from eating the finest foods. This led one to attain a state of tranquility, right? If you're not always trying to get stuff that's expensive, you're not driving yourself crazy to make a lot of money so you can buy it. You're willing to live modestly, and you're satisfied with what you have, right? That promotes tranquility, a freedom from fear, as well as absence of bodily pain. Although Epicureanism is a form of hedonism, right, because he believes that you should enjoy life, insofar as it declares pleasure to be the sole intrinsic good, its conception of the absence of pain is the greatest pleasure, and its advocacy of a simple life makes it different from hedonism as it is commonly understood, right? Hedonism, gross hedonism, is really about, the finer foods and enjoying eating as much and drinking as much and the best of everything, and being extravagant, whereas Epicurus himself was very modest. Okay, so now comes a very famous passage in Ecclesiastes. A season is set for everything, a time for every experience under heaven. You probably all heard this many times. A time for being born, a time for dying, a time for planting, and a time for uprooting the planted. It's a very beautiful kind of poetic style. A time for slaying and a time for healing, a time for tearing down and a time for building up, a time for weeping and a time for laughing, a time for wailing and a time for dancing, a time for throwing stones and a time for gathering stones, a time for embracing and a time for shunning embraces. I guess during this COVID period, it's a time for shunning embraces, at least outside of the family. A time for seeking and a time for losing, a time for keeping and a time for discarding, a time for ripping and a time for sewing, a time for silence and a time for speaking, a time for loving and a time for hating, a time for war and a time for peace. What value then can the man of affairs get from what he earns? I have observed the business that God gave men to be concerned with. He brings everything to pass precisely in its time. Everything comes in good time when it's appropriate. He also puts eternity in their minds, but without man ever guessing from first to last all the things that God brings to pass. We have an idea that there's going to be more to come, but we don't know what it's going to be. Only God does. Thus, I realized that the only worthwhile thing there is for them is to enjoy themselves and to do what is good in their lifetime. Do what is good. Right? This is the key. It's not about being a hedonist and getting everything for you and who cares about everybody else. It's about enjoying yourself, but doing what is good and right in your lifetime, because real enjoyment comes from being a good person. That's really what he's saying. Also, that whenever a man does not eat and drink and get enjoyment out of all his wealth, it is a gift from God. So whatever we get in life is always, remember always that everything you enjoy in life comes from God. And this is not Epicurus, because Epicurus believed that the gods really had nothing to do with humans. And so here, Kohelet is very different. He's putting the Epicurean philosophy in a very Jewish context, saying, yes, we should enjoy ourselves, but remember that everything we enjoy in life is a gift from God, and that also will help us to feel satisfied with what we have. I realize too that whatever God has brought to pass will recur evermore. Nothing can be added and nothing taken from it. What is occurring occurred long since, and what is to occur occurred long since. Okay, so that's it. Now that thing about to every season there is to everything there is a season, a purpose for everything under heaven, became a famous folk song sung by the Byrds. Turn, turn, turn. So after this, you can listen to that song. Okay, so now let's go to chapter 4. A couple other famous quotations from the book of Kohelet. I'm going to read it in the Hebrew occasionally because the Hebrew is kind of fun. Tovim hashnayim min ha'echad. That's two are better than one, right? That is a famous saying. It's better to have a partner in life if you can. And that's not always easy. Some people have difficulty finding partners. Sometimes we have a partner and we lose a partner. Of course, in that situation, we know how much we miss that person, and we hopefully we can find other ways to fill that void with friends or other acquaintances. But in any case, it is more pleasant to go through life with a partner if you can, and if you can't, to have friends surrounding you. He's going to say that 3 is even better than 2, so not in a not in one household necessarily, but it's better to have more people around you. It's to live life with. So 2 are better than 1. Tovim hashnayim min ha'echad, asher yesh lahem sechar tov ba'amalam. Right? 2 are better than 1. Why? In that they have greater benefit from their earnings. Right? You can share your earnings, and it's easier to get by in life if you can do that. For should they fall, if one person were not to lose their job, let's say, one can raise the other. But woe betide him who is alone and falls with no companion to raise him. Right? So that's why we have communities to help people who are alone and need help. That's when the community has to come in. But in life, if you have a partner, that is a big help. Further, when 2 lie together, they are warm. But how can he who is alone get warm? That's why God invented blankets and air conditioning and heaters. But it's true that it's a different experience when you have a partner. Also, if one attacks, 2 can stand up to him. And then he says, 3 is the best. A threefold cord is not readily broken. In Hebrew, it's hachut hamishulash lo yimhera yinatek. A 3-stranded cord is hard to break. So here he's saying, look, if you've got not just a life partner, but also another, let's say, good friend, so the 3 of you together is even better than 2. You can have 2 of them fall, a third one can raise them up. Between the 3 of you, you'll be able to protect and defend each other and support each other, etc. So the same could be said outside of marriage or outside of a committed relationship with friends. Just having a group of 3 friends together, you all help and support each other, and that's a good thing. But this idea that a threefold cord is hard to break is a very famous statement. kind of like a stool that has three legs is the most stable, right? Because the 3 points of the feet make a plane, and so it's a very stable piece of furniture. Okay, so now we're going to go to chapter 7. Just looking at some other verses here. I think Rabbi Strauss mentioned this once, and I think it might have been a Lunch and Learn recently. Tov Shem Mishemen Tov. Again, in Hebrew, it sounds very clever. It's a clever play on words. Tov Shem Mishemen Tov, right? You can hear the pun, the sort of alliteration there. So Tov Shem, a good name. Mishemen Tov, good oil. A good name is better than good oil, right? What is he saying? Well, oil, of course, back then was commodity, olive oil, especially the fine olive oil, fragrant. If it was mixed with some fragrant spices, that made it even more expensive. I imagine that perfumers, by the way, you know that the high priest, for instance, was anointed with olive oil, but it wasn't just olive oil. It was mixed with fragrant spices, and it was a special blend of spices that had a particular smell. So this is in the ancient world. That was the way you perfumed yourself. They didn't have Calvin Klein's Eternity back then. So instead, you took the medium of oil, you mixed it with the fragrant spices, and then you smeared it on your face, and then you smelled like those fragrant spices. So probably different. They were perfumeries, I would assume, back then as well, who would make their own special blends of perfume and sell them for quite a price. You know, if they were particularly popular, they could command quite a price for their perfumes. And so some perfumes actually were pretty expensive. So what he's saying is a good quality oil, that's fragrant oil, is not as good as a good name. Doesn't matter how good you smell. If you're a rotten person, people can tell. They can tell that even beyond the fragrant perfume you're wearing. So great expression, though, in Hebrew, Tov Shem Mishemen Tov. A good name is better than good oil. And then he has, don't say, how has it happened that former times were better than these? For it's not wise of you to ask that question. That may be a question that a lot of people are asking today. 3 months ago, we never would have believed we'd be here with quarantining ourselves still. How come it was so much better before? And so Kohelet's answer to that is, don't ask dumb questions. It's not going to help you any. If you look back to the good old days of before, whatever they were, first of all, we have convenient memories often of the past. We've sort of smoothed over the really rough parts. So we forget how unpleasant life was back then. But nevertheless, so whatever your situation is now, that's the world you're living in now. Just focus on the here and now and try to get as much enjoyment out of where you're living now. You know, when we talk about the good old days of the past, if it's more than, let's say, 100 years old or 200 years ago, we say, oh, life was so much simpler. Yeah, but they didn't have indoor plumbing, right? So you had to go to the outhouse. They didn't have piped-in gas, air conditioning, or anything like that. I mean, a lot of comforts of the modern world that we take for granted, they didn't have, and I'm sure life was not as pleasant. We would not necessarily want to go back to living those good old days. So he's what Kohelet says, don't ask about why were days better before. It's not wise of you to ask. In any case, we're living now. This is the life we have to live now. Let's make the most of it. That's exactly what he would say. Try to find enjoyment no matter what your circumstance is. Try to enjoy life. And then he says, for there is not one good man on earth who has done his best and hasn't erred. Right? Nobody is perfect. So don't beat yourself up when you make mistakes. Nobody is perfect, right? Everybody makes mistakes. Just move on with your life, learn from your mistakes, get better, and try and live the best you can in the future. Finally, don't pay attention to everything that is said, so that you may not hear your slave reviling you. Right? Don't go like looking for trouble, right? Everybody says some things that are not pleasant. You shouldn't go trying to find out all the unpleasant things that people say. It's only going to make you unhappy. And in any case, remember, for well you remember the many times that you yourself have reviled others. Right? So if you hear somebody saying something about you or whatever, just remember all the times you might have complained about somebody else. Don't go looking for trouble. Don't make a big deal out of it. Again, try to live the best life you can. You're living in this world. You live a good life. You enjoy what you have, and be good. Remember that being good is like the key element of what he wants us to do. Here's another famous statement from Kohelet. The dust returns to the ground where it came, but the life breath returns to God. Shov ha'afar el haaretz kishehaya. The dust returns to the ground from where it came. V'haruach tashuv el Elohim. But the spirit returns to God, asher natna, who gave it. Right? We sometimes say that at funerals. It's a verse from Ecclesiastes. So he does believe in life after death in a way. He says the life breath returns to God. So although he seems to say that this is all there is to life, he does seem to have, at least here, some kind of an idea that there's an afterlife, a spiritual afterlife, that you return to God in the afterlife, but only your body returns to earth. Nevertheless, he says, utter futility is life. Oh dear. Okay. Kohelet sought to discover useful sayings and recorded genuinely truthful sayings. The sayings of the wise are like goads. This is another famous quote from Kohelet. The sayings of the wise are like goads, like nails fixed in prodding sticks. They were given by one shepherd. Right? So all the sayings of the wise people come from God. God inspired this wisdom. Regardless, and maybe he's saying even the Greek philosophers, when they speak wisdom, they were inspired by God as well, perhaps. And why are they like goads? A goad is what a shepherd uses to steer the sheep in the right direction, right? So if you hear bits of wisdom that try to guide you on a good path in life, those ideas came from God. They were inspired by God, and we should try to follow them in order to live a good life. So that's what he says. Sayings of the wise are like goads, another famous quote from Kohelet. A further word, against them, my son, be warned. The making of many books is without limit. Yeah, so maybe one day I'll take you on a tour of my house and I'll show you all the books in our house. We've got thousands of volumes. I actually cataloged them all. And I can testify to the fact that the making of many books is without limit. Even before Amazon, we knew that. But now that we have Amazon, you can find, gazillion books there. There's just tons of books, more things to learn. And he says, don't get too caught up in that either, If you try to read every single book, you'll wear yourself out, and it's not really worth it in the end. Find some good books that give some wisdom, but don't feel like you have to read everything there is out there. The making of many books is without limit. And much study is a wearying of the flesh, right? So spend some time enjoying life. Of course you should read. Of course you should expand your mind. But if you binge watch something on Netflix once in a while, I guess, that's part of enjoying life too. The sum of the matter, when all is said and done, and this is the end of the book, revere God and observe his commandments, for this applies to all mankind, that God will call every creature to account for everything unknown, be it good or bad. The sum of the matter, when all is said and done, revere God and observe his commandments. That's repeated at the end over here because we always want to end reading a book on a happy note. Okay, so now we want to know, when was this book written? When was this book written? I mean, so why do we read it on? Why do we read it on Passover? And so let's do that over here. Okay, boom. Okay. So why do we read the book on not on Passover? Why do we read it on Sukkot? So it may seem odd that on Zman Simchatenu, Sukkot is called Zman Simchatenu, the time of our great joy, we read such a depressing book. But we also leave the security of our homes to live in a temporary dwelling in a sukkah, in accordance with the theme of Kohelet, that possessions are fleeting and vain. So that is one of the aspects of the holiday. And so we remember that, look, the things which we think are so important in our lives all year around are not as important, right? And by putting away the things and going outside and living a simple life, the one that Kohelet would recommend, we remember the important things in life. And that's what Kohelet is trying to teach us ultimately. Not that life is depressing, but that we should focus on the value of the time we're allotted in life, and not get caught up in the things that are transient and temporary. Focus on being good. Good is universal and eternal, and focus on enjoying life, because life, this is what you are supposed to do in life. Enjoy it, but mostly also to be good. In the end, Kohelet teaches us to enjoy life to the fullest, to cherish every moment, especially with friends. Two is better than one, and a threefold cord is hard to break. It is perhaps the flip side, or another version of the Unatana Tokev prayer that we recite on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, where God is sitting on the throne and the book of life is open before him and our lives is written in it, and he determines our fate. Kohelet, too, holds a mirror up to our lives, reminds us that our time is short, and forces us to focus on what is truly important. So although it can be read as a depressing book, I think its ultimate message is to focus on the important things in life, to live a good life, and about love and commitment, right? Because two is better than one, and a threefold cord is hard to break. It's about developing relationships with the people who matter in your life, because that's what really counts. And to do that, and to live a good life, to be decent, and not to get too caught up in the things that we normally try to do. So I think even though it is a bit of a sobering book, maybe it's a good thing to read at a time like this, when we are sort of trapped in our homes to some extent, to remember what's important in life: our friends, our family, the community, preserving life at all costs, or not at all costs, but to preserve life as much as we can, and to try and to improve the world and to make it better. So reading Ecclesiastes reminds us of these eternal truths in life. And so that's the story of the Ecclesiastes. We've now read 3 of the 5 Megillas that are read on special holidays. And I'll come up with something new for next week's Lunch and Learn. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed them, and we'll see you next week.